Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on managing complaints. They say that there are two inevitabilities in life, death, taxes, and you can probably add a third one, complaints, to that. Hopefully, we will provide some practical advice drawn from our experience of representing particular professionals to provide you with some practical steps that will hopefully allow you to manage the complaints process. Next slide. As you may have guessed, I'm Alisdair Matheson. I'm a partner in the Professional Indemnity team here at Brodie's, and I'm presenting today with Joe Kelbrick, who is an associate in the team. Next slide. Now, we're part of what is Scotland's largest professional indemnity team. And while our experience and expertise is mainly drawn from representing professionals and their insurers in a whole range of business sectors, we think that the experience we have drawn from that is still relevant to the wider business context. People are quite willing to complain about pretty much anything, and in particular professional services, so we have quite a lot of experience in dealing with that. Next slide, please. So, quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, and you may have been drawn to the quote from the Scottish Legal Complaints Commission on the screen. Yes, it is true, complaints are even made against lawyers, and it's interesting that the body that receives official complaints against lawyers says that you can be a almost perfect lawyer, no matter how good you are, you're still going to get complaints because you can't satisfy everyone all of the time. So as we're going to go through today, we're going to look at who complains. And funnily enough, I don't think I'm stealing Joe's thunder. She'll be dealing with that. That is everyone and anyone, but in particular those who are providing services or products for consumers, probably, but it's not just consumers. You will find that coming in the commercial sphere as well. We'll look at what they complain about. And again, I'm probably not stealing your thunder to say everything and anything. We'll look at the role of client relations manager, which is really pretty key in this day and age. We'll spend a bit of time discussing the kind of attributes that a client relations manager should have and the steps that they should take. We'll look at regulatory complaints, which in our experience are becoming more and more common, particular for professionals. The low cost against the possible opportunity that it has for them in some circumstances gaining compensation, but in others just shaking the tree a little bit to see what falls out. We'll look at insurance cover. In some sectors, complaints, when they overlap with potential claims, can mean that you can claim on your insurance policy for the representation that you receive or obtain in dealing with a complaint. And then we'll try and look a little bit to the future to see what emerging trends there are, which probably means that there are going to be some more complaints for all of us.
First, consider what a complaint actually is. Well, it's any expression of dissatisfaction, whether that be the formal written complaint, a comment made over the telephone, or even a tweet. So complaints are generally a lot more broad and perhaps less scientific than you might have expected. And dealing with them can be very time consuming and costly no matter what shape they take. There was data published last year by the Institute of Customer Service, which found that UK firms were spending just over £9 billion every month in worker hours covering complaints handling, which I found a quite shocking statistic. But we also have to consider the negative impact that they can have on an organisation's reputation, and also the really negative impact it can have on the individual that the complaint is directed to. And what it does is it really emphasises the need for all organisations, whether it's professional services or otherwise, to develop effective complaints handling protocols. Now, complaints more often than not do originate from your client or your customer, but they can come from anybody you or your organisation comes into contact with. That might be clients of other businesses, your competitors, other third parties out there in the marketplace who might be affected by the advice that you've given. And in some cases, it might even be your own regulator that decides to pursue a complaint if they become aware of circumstances that they think need to be investigated. So let's move on to have a look at why it is people complain. Now, in our experience, the vast majority of complaints tend to be about the level of service as opposed to, getting the advice wrong. And on the slide, there's going to come up a number of tiles which represent some of the most common grounds of complaint that we see. And communication is a really big source of complaints. In fact, 22% of all complaints about solicitors relate to communication issues. It is a bit of an umbrella term and it's linked to a lot of other causes, but professionals are often criticised for presenting advice in a way that's difficult for a client to digest. And sometimes there's tension between what a professional thinks they need to say against what the recipient of that communication actually wants to know. But it's not just the content of communication which can lead to complaints, it's the frequency of it as well. So even if work product is perfect, a period of silence can be hugely detrimental to how the customer or the client feels about the service they've received come the end of the deal. Unrealistic expectations is another big cause of complaint, and that's where a client is not getting something that they expected. And that often arises as a result of a lack of clear communication about what was likely to be the outcome of a process. Sometimes it's a wee bit more nuanced than that. It might be that the client just wasn't suitably sort of warmed up for a key stage in the process, typically a bad news event. So sometimes they're distracted by the surprise of that, and rather being able to focus on the really fantastic work that you've done for them, they're focusing on an unexpected outcome. So this means we need to think really carefully about what the client or the customer needs to be told and when it is they need to be told that to avoid any unnecessary surprises. So it's really just about managing your client's expectations. Personnel is the next cause of complaint that we see quite commonly. That's sometimes just down to a personality clash. More often than not, it's a perceived lack of experience by the person given the advice, or lack of seniority, lack of supervision. But consistency is also really important here, and having a key point of contact can really help build the trust of a client and minimise the risk of complaints arising. And that's because it's easier for that point of contact to recognise issues which are pertinent to that client, be that cultural or otherwise, or maybe there's vulnerabilities there that need to be recognised, and sometimes just recognising that a little bit of additional assistance is needed, and that can go a really long way. The next tile I wanted to look at is outcome, which is quite an obvious source of complaints. If a client doesn't get what they want from your services, you are much more likely to see a complaint materialising from that. That often comes down to the client's expectations not having been properly managed. And that means discussing the whole range of potential outcomes, including the less favourable, and just managing your client's expectations in that regard. And one thing I would recommend as well is when that advice is given, make sure that you document it, whether that's just on a file note or whether it's ideally followed up in an email to your client, covering off what the range of potential outcomes can be. That can really help manage expectations, and not just doing it at the outset and never touching on it again. It is something which you should revisit at key stages. Next is timescales. Things do overrun, hopefully not today's session right enough, but delays are encountered. Sometimes they're out with our control, but I would say in our experience, many complaints could have been avoided had realistic expectations on timescale been set at the outset of an instruction. And keeping your client involved and appraised on why delays might be encountered. Just keeping your client updated even when there isn't really an update to give can be really important, because again, a period of silence when the client doesn't know what's going on can result in being a cause of complaint. The last tile on the slide there is cost. That probably comes as no surprise to you that cost is an issue which regularly gives rise to complaints. But the source of that is more to do with a lack of transparency about fees given at the outset of an instruction, or a failure to keep a check on costs as a matter progresses. So it can be wise to check in with your client and give them an update before you issue an invoice, particularly if that invoice is fairly chunky. Okay, so when do complaints arise? Well, we've already looked at a couple of those there about, an unexpected outcome or an unexpected invoice. But generally speaking, situations where there are limited resources and an increase in stress or pressure, whether personal or business, that creates an ideal breeding ground for complaints. But we need to look at the wider factors as well. And statistics show that developments in any particular sector can have an impact upon complaints trends. Each sector will differ, but I've put on the slide there a graph by the Financial Conduct Authority from data which they've collected about complaints. Now, it does date back a few years ago, but it really nicely illustrates that there have been spikes in certain points of time in the number of complaints received. And in fact, you can see that they are actually steadily increasing over the years. Now, I'll just looking at the last two spikes there, there was a spike in 2012, which the FCA have attributed to PPI complaints. And then there was another spike just at the tail end of the graph there in 2016, 2017, which was attributed to a new complaint system being introduced. It's not just sectoral developments, it's also social, political, and economic developments which can impact the likelihood of complaints and claims being made. Both claims and complaints against professionals nearly always increase when there is an economic downturn, and that's because when money is tight, organisations look more carefully at their prospects of recouping some losses. That was particularly evident post 2008 crash in the residential housing market, where borrowers were defaulting and lenders were looking to recoup some of the losses. They were looking to surveyors who advise on property values, and they were looking at solicitors who paired the security documentation. But we've also seen something similar more recently following the COVID-19 lockdowns. The Financial Ombudsman Service reported a 36% increase in insurance-related complaints compared to the year before. And a significant proportion of those were attributed to business interruption insurance, and I'm sure you've seen quite a lot of that in the press. There's also been a lot of major political events in recent years. We've had Brexit, the Scottish independence referendum. So it's reasonable to expect that there is going to be higher incidences of complaints and claims in certain sectors following events such as that. So all organisations would be well advised to tighten up on their complaints handling procedures when a period of economic downturn or a major political event is forecast. So on that note, I'll pass you over to Alisdair, who's going to continue to look at the best practice in this respect.
Thank you. Well, just as the rest of the slide pops up, you'll see a conveyor belt of Smarties. And these are some key points along the road where you can either reduce the prospect of complaints or reduce the impact of complaints once they're made. The first of those on the left at the bottom of the screen is getting your terms of business right. And that's important for at least two reasons. First of all, it allows you to set the scope of what you're providing and the general relationship. And by that, I mean, what is it that you're actually going to be providing and what communication levels and, as Joe was mentioned, fees or costs are going to be incurred in it. Very often the kind of claims we deal with that are either a legal claim or they are a complaint about a lack of service relate to failing to draw the boundaries of what is being provided well. So that might be an architect looking at a project. Are they going to carry out site inspections as the project continues? Are they not? Are they going to design a particular piece of the building that might have a specialist expertise required, like cladding, for example? If you get the scope set out at the beginning, along with how frequently you're going to communicate, how often there are going to be meetings or updates, etc., and those costs, if you get that sorted at the beginning, when there's usually a great deal of enthusiasm, goodwill, then generally speaking, you're less likely to get a complaint. The other reason is formally and legally, Many sectors, in particular the professional services side, require people to issue terms of business engagement letters, however you want to call it, at the beginning of a relationship and indeed each piece of work. Lawyers, for example, are required by the Law Society of Scotland on every instruction to issue a letter of engagement, unless we act a lot for insurers, you have an overarching framework agreement in place. But for the vast majority of instructions, you need to get a letter of engagement out there. Otherwise, and it's a tick box exercise, otherwise you end up being in breach of your regulatory obligations. And the second thing is, terms of business have normally been set up, and this is not so much about complaints, but it's more to do with claims. Terms of business have usually been set up having had some thought to them. And if you are providing the service or you're providing goods, then it's set up in your benefit, to your benefit, to have things like limitations of liability, to have things like provisions on when you can invoice and how much you can invoice, how those invoices are to be calculated, and all that kind of thing means that you don't need, being there means you don't need to think about it specifically for an individual instruction. Then, as we've said, complaints are inevitable no matter how well you prepare for them. You need a complaints handling procedure. Now, we earlier on this morning had a fire alarm drill, which we have every Wednesday at 10 o'clock, which I frequently forget and then give a fright. And I don't know how many years we've been in this building, 6, 7 years, still get a fright. Have we had a real fire? No. But we still have practice drills, etc. And that's what I would say about a complaints procedure. Make sure that the whole team is trained on it. And even if that is only the first couple of steps, which are to inform the client relations manager, or however you wish to describe them, it's important that everyone is on board with that and there is some degree of knowledge of what that system involves, practice. It doesn't have to be terribly involved in terms of whether you run practice scenarios, etc. But everyone should be available, everyone should be completely familiar with it, and it should be readily available so that people can think, is this relationship beginning to look like there might be a complaint or a claim made? If so, then it needs to be completely clear how that procedure kicks in and who that person tells. And actually that's one thing that's very important, is to have a blame-free environment. If there is a problem, and bear in mind it might be because someone's made a mistake, but it might not be. It might simply be that they're unfortunate enough to have an unreasonable client or customer. What you don't want is someone to be afraid of making that report, taking that step and informing the client relations manager. You want a blame-free culture, because it's more important if someone's made a mistake that they come to you with their hand up and say, we have a problem here. It can be dealt with, it can be nipped in the bud. You don't want it rumbling on. The other side of having a complaints handling procedure in place is that many professions in particular, but many regulatory environments require you to have a complaints handling procedure. It doesn't have to be 10 pages long, but there just needs to be a complaints handling procedure in place, which is provided to anyone that indicates that they have a problem with the service or goods that they've been supplied with. Now, this can seem utterly artificial if, for example, you're a sole practitioner. My complaints procedure is that I will consider the complaint you're making to me about me, but it still is a tick box exercise. You still need it in place. And we've dealt with, for example, the Architects Registration Board, and they require that to be there. Even if it's a sole practitioner dealing with it, it's a tick box exercise, because from their perspective, what it does is it sets out to the client or the customer what is going to happen in clear steps, so that they don't have that lack of an understanding of where things are going and what stages they're going to be reached. That is what the regulator is looking for. Net relations manager, absolutely key, and I'll go into discuss that in a little bit more detail because it is so important. Risk management analysis comes at the end. So you've had a complaint, it's gone through the procedure, it's been dealt with obviously successfully and smoothly by the client relations manager. So what you're left with is a happy customer, a happy client, and you then move on to think, well, what provoked that? What because that was it, that the customer client was so demanding that there was always going to happen? Possibly. But usually there's something that could have been done better, whether it's a diary system that means that they would have been hanging on for a response for you, whether it's procedures that need to be put in place, whether it's actually a defect in the advice or the item that was being provided to them. It's important to learn lessons and use it as, and it sounds terrible, and when you're saying this at the end of a claim, for example, it's very difficult for someone to take this on board, but view it as a positive experience, because very often if a complaint or a claim is dealt with well, it means that you actually retain a client, or you get them telling their friends, their colleagues, well, I find this firm pretty good. We did have a problem once, but you know what? It was dealt with so well that I'm happy to go back to them, because I know if there's a problem, we'll be able to deal with it in a sensible and a mature manner. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I mentioned the client relations manager and why that role is so important. It's because they're a gatekeeper for this. They're the manager that deals with the action on the pitch, as it were. They direct how things are going, and they're the point of contact for the person making the claim or the complaint. It's important that that individual has knowledge of the rules and guidance that apply to that particular business area or profession. Regulation is such an important part of almost everyone's professional life today, and I use that in the widest sense, and it's only going to get more. It's unlikely that despite successive governments talking about bonfire of red tape, that we're going to have much less red tape, and that's directed partly at substantive things like environmental protection, whatever, but it very often, as Joe's highlighted before, about process, about making sure that professionals who generally are in the driving seat in relationships, and that's why someone who does not deal with a particular matter on a day-to-day basis comes to a professional or comes to an organisation to purchase goods or services. It's why they're coming to them. The client relations manager needs to then investigate the circumstances. Now, that and liaising with and responding to the complainer means that you need to think carefully about who you're choosing as a client relations manager. Now, if it's a two-partner firm, then it will probably just be the person that's not dealing with, that hasn't been dealing with the matter that has given rise to the first place. If you have a larger firm, think carefully about who the client relations manager is going to be. For a start, it's very useful to have someone that's one step removed from whatever the complaint relates to. That provides some separation, and one hopes a bit of objectivity to the consideration of the matter. It also will create an idea in the complainer's head that they're getting a fair crack of the whip. Personally, I'm sure Joe will agree, when you are dealing with a complaint against a professional services firm, and we've been instructed, for example, and that may or may not involve a claim as well, it is really useful to have someone that is not the person that's the subject of the complaint dealing with it, because they're not as personally invested in it. They can take a step back, they can look at things objectively. And to be honest, for the person complained against, although they will no doubt want to put forward their recollections and their take on the matter forcefully, it is also easier for them to move on with the rest of their life, personal and business, without having to think about this on a daily basis, or waking up in the middle of the night thinking, oh God, how am I going to draft this response to the complaint? So there are a couple of aspects of that that means that it's important to have someone that's separate and independent. Who are you going to choose the client's relationship manager? Well, my advice would also be someone that is good at relationships. You wouldn't want necessarily to pick, in a legal context, the best lawyer. for example. What you want is the best person who to empathise with, not necessarily sympathise with, but empathise with the person making the complaint or the claim, because you very much want to avoid it being an adversarial interaction. And if you can empathise with them, it can be a journey you take together. That also goes for finding a solution. Because we're talking about complaints here, there may be absolutely no legal responsibility for a mistake or an error in a piece of advice that's been provided, a design that's been drafted, or an item that's been provided. But that's where you need to be a little inventive and collaborative in trying to resolve a complaint before it drags everyone into what can ultimately become trench warfare, depending on how fixed the parties' positions come from. And it may be possible, as I've said, if it's dealt with well and imaginatively, to enhance a relationship with what might be a very important client or customer for your business. As part of that, you need to identify the risk of an escalation to become a civil claim. Might it become, instead of a complaint about service, a complaint about a legal defect or something that will sound in damages? That will escalate matters. It will make things more expensive and more involved for you, and has the potential to become very much more public. Court actions, for example, are publicly reported, and if there is a proof, say, a hearing and evidence, that's technically open, and while it's unlikely that it will be of such newsworthy value that people will want to report it in the press, you never know. If you can keep it at the stage of trying to find inventive and commercial solution, then you stop it escalating. If it is going to escalate, then you need to think about whether you notify insurers. If you have insurance in place that covers indemnity matters, as we'll go on to look at later, then you need to look at the point in time that you need to advise your insurers. Sorry, I don't know if you're seeing. There are steps you can take to prevent matters, keep records of complaints. That might prove very useful if it does escalate into a civil claim. It also allows you to undertake that risk management process I was talking about. It might allow you to identify where there are common themes coming through and develop and adapt your policies. And in particular, and this is the soft skills bit, it allows you to drive the culture forward. And if you can drive the culture forward, you have fewer complaints and a lack of the waste of time and stress in dealing with them as they go ahead. I will now pass you back to Joe, who's going to look at some of the regulatory environments that we deal with and deal with complaints.
Thanks, Alisdair. Okay, so where a complaint can't be resolved in-house, it may end up before the advisor's professional regulator or perhaps an ombudsman. Complainers are becoming more sophisticated in their approach, and my colleagues and I are increasingly seeing instances where there's types of complaints that are being raised alongside civil claims, and that's generally with a view to trying to add some pressure and to drive progress forward. Now, I've mentioned just a few of the regulators on the slide, but there are many more out there, and each regulator has its own processes, and we couldn't possibly cover all today, but what I would like to do is just pull out a number of common themes adopted by most regulators. Starting with eligibility, generally speaking, most regulators will have an initial assessment to determine whether the complaint is one appropriate for them to take forward. They'll look at things like whether the complaint is premature. For instance, a disgruntled client might lodge a complaint directly with a professional body before giving the organisation or the individual the opportunity to first resolve that. In some circumstances, it might be that the complaint is obviously vexatious or obviously, completely without merit. And if that's the case, then the regulator is likely to decide not to take it forward for investigation. Certain regulators distinguish between complaints about service and conduct. Service issues are about the quality of the service that the client might expect. So, delivering on your commitments and maintaining high levels of communication. On the other hand, conduct is typically about the behaviour of an individual advisor and, whether they have acted honestly and in accordance with the professional's body's standards and values. The service type complaints are by far the most common, and also they are arguably easier to remediate. Now, when it comes to the process, rest assured that the mere fact that a complaint has been made to a regulator and accepted for investigation doesn't necessarily mean that there will go on to be a finding. My experience is that regulators spend the time, and quite often quite a bit of time, thoroughly investigating matters. They seek commentary, usually on multiple occasions. They allow both sides of a dispute to make representations, to respond to allegations, provide supporting evidence. And as the investigation progresses, the complaint often becomes more refined, which is certainly helpful. And I've put alternative dispute resolution on the slide there is because more and more regulatory bodies are becoming very encouraging of dispute resolution, in particular mediation. And that can lead to parties being able to agree a resolution amongst themselves without the regulatory body having to go on and make a formal determination. However, if we get to the stage where a regulator is issuing a determination in favour of the complainer, then there are still a range of possible outcomes. These can range from a written warning, which is like a slap on the wrist, to a period of suspension, even erasure from that regulator's register of members. And sometimes they might apply sanctions which restricts the ability of the professional to practice. So that might be ensuring that the professional is supervised with a view to prevent that same type of issue arising again. Some regulators have the power to award financial compensation. Generally, though, these awards are capped. They are typically less than what a complainer would be able to recover with a civil claim, say, but the financial compensation can vary significantly between the regulators. Where a determination is issued by the regulator, it's often published on their website, and this can be picked up and reported in industry press and newsletters. And obviously this can have quite a negative consequence for the organisation in terms of their representation, in terms of their reputation, but it can also be really stressful for the individuals involved. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why, and a desire to avoid this type of outcome is one of the reasons why we're seeing a much greater interest and an increase in alternative dispute resolution when it comes to complaints as well. So I will pass you back to Alisdair to continue discussing what typically happens when matters do escalate.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So insurance coverage, it won't be relevant to every complaint, but in particular in professional services practices, you will find that a complaint will often be parallel to or suggest a circumstance that might end up being a claim. And by that, I mean a legal right that would result in damages as opposed to a complaint, which might also be the subject matter of a claim, but a complaint can be something about, for example, a purely service level issue, which would not in court sound in damages necessarily, but a regulator might find would be compensatable. If you are the client relations manager, it makes sense that you also deal with insurance notifications. Because a circumstance that arises, because if a set of facts give rise to a complaint, it is quite possible that they may also give rise to a claim. And that's important because if you have a professional indemnity policy, then you will have an obligation to notify not just when claims come in, but also when a circumstance arises that might reasonably lead to a claim. And you'll need to notify that, because if you want to have the safety of the indemnity cover, should the complaint escalate into a claim, then you need to have notified as soon as you were aware that it was reasonably possible that you might have a claim, as opposed to just a complaint. It is also sensible to do that, because many insurers will be quite happy to pay for someone like Joe or I to give you a hand in dealing with a complaint if it might impact on a claim. As Joe's mentioned, we see the two not infrequently interrelated now. There's a very low opportunity cost in making a complaint to a regulator for the complainer, but they may be able to shake the tree, as it were, and see what falls out, what correspondence is lodged or disclosed, what submissions are made that might make it a more attractive proposition to make the claim itself. So although you might not have a specific cover for dealing with legal complaints, and it's possible the policy might have that. Some policies are quite generous, because a set of circumstances, a set of facts that might give rise to a complaint might also give rise to a claim, and that's what insurers are interested in. They sometimes see that as part and parcel of that. Generally speaking, as mentioned in the bullet point, you will not get coverage for most financial penalties. And by that, I mean a fine. So if you receive an order that you require to pay something that could be equated with a regulatory penalty, or something of that ilk, equivalent of, a parking ticket fine or something like that, it won't be covered by insurance. But if the regulator is awarding compensation rather than a penalty, then that is quite possibly covered by your insurance cover. And it may be a question you're actually asking yourself, but it makes sense to deal with it just now. What's the difference? Well, compensation would provide payment for a loss you've incurred. So let's say it's a solicitor and they have not been particularly good at putting conveyancing in place when you're buying a house, and they've missed out on the fact that you need a right of access over someone else's ground to park your car. That's possible to get later, but it'll cost some money. Now, you might also have taken a long time to revert to your client and say, there's a problem. We need to go to the neighbouring proprietor and ask them for this servitude right of access so you can park your car. Complaints made to the SLCC, and that's partly because there was a delay in responding to the initial notification of the issue. And that element, and an award is then made by the SLCC. Now, that might partly be for the delay in service, but it might also be for the price of paying the neighbouring proprietor to grant the servitude right and the legal fees involved in preparing the documentation and registering that. Now, the insurance cover would probably provide the money for that legal work and the purchase price for the servitude right, but it wouldn't indemnify for the service failing. That's something that you'd have to take on the chin yourself. Now, I'll move on. I'll pass over back to Joe, who can then deal with the direction of travel and emerging trends.
Thanks, Alisdair. Well, with the first one on the slide there is compensation culture, and it's a phrase that's used to define a society that capitalises on any opportunity to claim compensation. It's predominantly used in relation to personal injury claims. We sometimes associate it with the US system, where there are high value lawsuits. They've been making headlines for years. Whether a compensation culture actually exists in the UK is a debate for another day, but the general public are more knowledgeable than ever about their options and better equipped to make claims. A quick Google and you can find plenty of template complaint letters to script from. And we are seeing an increase in complaints, especially to a professionals regulator, being used as a tactic alongside civil claims. I mentioned that earlier, and I suspect we will continue to see that, that trend on an upwards trajectory. Social media, especially Twitter, are well known for being platforms where customers can air their complaints. From a complaints perspective, it's all too easy for reputations to be destroyed very quickly if with a public complaint, if it's on Twitter and if it's not resolved appropriately. And it's for this very reason that some companies choose not to respond publicly on Twitter, say. Whereas, there's been others that have gone viral for their successful and sometimes quite humorous handling of complaints. We've certainly dealt with numerous claims and complaints where clients have taken to airing their frustration and complaints about their advisors online or threatening to do so. Alisdair and I are not PR professionals, so we can't advise on the best online strategy, but of course we do urge caution, and really, I guess, don't tweet anything that you wouldn't want your mum to read. I've mentioned cyber attacks because they are increasing in frequency and sophistication. They've been doing so for years, and they spiked during the pandemic when businesses were struggling to cope with inadequate IT and remote working. Cyber attacks can have, hugely detrimental consequences for an organisation's reputation. There's lots been in the press about that, but it can also result in fines. It can result in claims, complaints from clients who have been compromised by the attack, and that might be from data breaches or simply delays and missed deadlines from the organisation being unable to access their systems. The last thing I wanted to mention in terms of where we may see a trend emerging in the complaints landscape is in relation to vulnerable clients. The Financial Conduct Authority published guidance in 2021, which related to ensuring the fair treatment of customers in vulnerable circumstances. This was, partially a response to a sharp rise in customers deemed as vulnerable during the pandemic-related lockdowns. The FCA have made it clear that they will take action in the financial sector where firms fail to meet their obligations to treat customers fairly, and I suspect that will apply for numerous other sectors and their regulators. And I suspect we will see a rise in complaints in the coming years where businesses and professionals fail to make appropriate adjustments for vulnerable clients. So it's important now, if an organisation has not done already, to develop and implement appropriate policies for dealing with vulnerable clients. So I think that's a quick canter through those, and I will, conscious of time, pass you over to Alisdair to.
Well, feel free to give us, drop us a line or give us a ring if you do have any questions or concerns, or indeed need some assistance with complaints. You've got our details there, and earlier on, I think the slides will also be sent to you. You had the full team sheet if either Joe or I are not available. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time today. I hope you found it interesting, but if nothing else, informative.